Hey everybody, this is Ben dropping you a quick note. Our editors have been working hard to get episodes finished to release on schedule with the reading of the week. Our hope is that listeners will have the chance to engage with the content and share meaningful ideas in their circles of family, friends, and church. In order to meet this goal, this episode has been released with minimal editing. We are looking for additional volunteers to join the team and help with editing, social media management, and content creation. If you are interested, please reach out to us on Facebook or email latterdaypeacestudies@gmail.com. You can also donate to the project, helping us cover the costs of things like website hosting and podcast platform fees. Donations can be made through PayPal by going to our website, latterdaypeacestudies.org, clicking Get Involved, and scrolling down to the donate box. Thanks so much to all who have helped out and donated over the years. We are sincerely grateful. Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me as outlined by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our hope is that as we discuss the Scriptures, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives.
Welcome back to Latter-day Peace Studies. I'm Ben Peterson.
And I'm Christopher Hurtado.
We are going to be covering Matthew chapter 21 and 22, Mark chapter 11, Luke chapter 19 and 20, and John chapter 12 today.
So we have some overlap again.
Yeah.
We have sort of some parallel stories. It might be helpful to, in studying this, to look at the parallel Gospels document we put together. We're building an email list. We don't have anything to email yet, but we might want to email you someday. If that's okay with you and you'd like to get access to the Gospel Parallels document, send us your email address and we'll get it to you.
Yeah, these chapters do sync up decently well compared to some other readings we have. I think next week we kind of get off again, but there is some syncing going on here. We start off with, in the narrative, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, right? So this is Palm Sunday. So Jesus is entering into Jerusalem. He goes to the temple. He has this episode where he drives out the money changers. We had a discussion about this in John earlier, and so we'll get into that. He then has discussions with people there on the temple grounds, and he has this famous interchange about the taxes, and we get this statement, render unto Caesar, so we'll get into some of that. Some more discussions with Sadducees as well, and polemics.
Including marriage.
Right. So that's kind of where the narrative is here. We're the beginning of the end, right?
Yeah, we're getting there.
Here, as we wind down the last week of Jesus' life, here is where we're starting.
Is that really where we end up, Ben? I mean, with these, I just don't know what's going on with the curriculum sometimes. Are we really getting there?
Yeah. Well, we've still got quite a few more weeks in the Gospels, because I think we, slow down with some of the narrative and get into more of the details with that Holy Week there. But here we're starting off with these first day or two when he enters Jerusalem.
All right.
So here in the first couple verses of Matthew, Jesus sends a couple of his disciples to go get a donkey and the donkey's mother and bring them back to him, and he's going to ride them into Jerusalem. Now, couple problems with this right off the bat, right, Christopher? First off, How do you ride two animals? And second, Mark and Luke both have this as a single animal, not multiple animals.
So we spent about an hour, right? We spent an hour going into multiple English translations, including altars of the Hebrew Bible, because this is referring back to Zechariah 9:9. We looked at the Greek. We looked at the Septuagint, we looked at the Hebrew, and of course, Mark and Luke. And we're really a little bit puzzled by this, aren't we?
Yeah, and as it turns out, too, John also agrees that it's a single animal, right? So Mark, Luke, and John are all calling this just a single animal, which seems to make the most sense. But for some reason, Matthew seems insistent on this because, again, if Mark is a source for Matthew, I would have thought that Matthew's just looking at Mark and saying, yeah, it's a single animal. But Matthew, his point actually is to go back to the books of the Old Testament, right? Back into the prophets and show how Jesus is fulfilling all of these things. And so for Matthew, when he's looking back at Zechariah, apparently he's interpreting this as two animals. So he has to put in the text that it's two animals because it has to be an exact fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9. Well, it turns out that Matthew's reading of Zechariah 9:9 probably just wasn't very good compared to the others, apparently. And who knows exactly how this happened. But you have different translations of this. Matthew probably is working off of the Greek translation, the Septuagint, and there's some ambiguity there.
Yeah, and I don't know about the Septuagint. I think that may be worth looking into further and bringing it up again later if we find anything there. But looking at the Hebrew, I think you can see how if Matthew had read the Hebrew, which we don't think he did, right? We think he read the Greek translation. Then you can see how this mistake could have come about because you have an and, which Hebrew is full of ands. Ben, you and I know Arabic. This is a cognate language with Hebrew. I've studied a little Hebrew. You have none, right? But I know that like Arabic, Hebrew is full of ands.
Sure.
There are no periods.
Yeah.
There are no sentences. They're just and.
There's no punctuation otherwise. And so and is kind of thrown in as this filler kind of operates as punctuation sometimes.
Right. It's just va, 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 or wa, 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 wa in Arabic. So you just have that. And it's funny because the interlinear, Greek English translation we find on Bible Hub shows us a translation, and this is Zechariah, right?
Yes, Zechariah 9:9.
It shows us a translation from the Hebrew for Va'al, and it translates it and. Well, Va is and. What about Al? And it turns out it translates upon, right? So that's that. So there's not really an and that's actually doing anything here. There's an and, but it's not doing anything. It's not a conjunction, put it that way.
We can't translate it as and.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. But Matthew seems to, and the and gives him the number 2 as opposed to just a single animal. So anyway, it's a curiosity, right? I'm not sure what difference it makes to the overall narrative, but it does sort of illuminate, I guess, a bit about the author, right? Matthew, and what he's aiming at and where he's looking for his sources and the point that he's trying to make. So getting into the actual narrative and what's going on here, one of the ways that this is interpreted with what's going on with Jesus sitting on this donkey and entering the city. So first off, the people actually go out to meet him, right? It's not just as he's coming in the gate, right? They're actually going out to him. And this is sort of an illusory or symbolic illusion here of a triumphal return of a king, right? So the king goes out to battle, he conquers, he's victorious, and then he returns to the city. And as he's returning, the people will go out to meet him. They'll bring, him gifts, or they'll wave palms, they'll put things on the path, just like they did for Jesus. And then as he's entering the city, the procession continues and gets larger and so forth to this triumphal entry of a royal procession. So
yeah, the symbolism of the palm is, victory won, right? Also eternal life, and even fertility. So they're symbols of the archetypal king, right?
They are.
Yeah.
And this is sort of what sparks off a series of events that sort of set up Jesus as the Messiah or archetypal king for the Jews in opposition to Caesar and Rome. And so there's several episodes that happen that sort of keep reiterating this point and are sort of the steps along the path that end up having Jesus on the cross as crucified as an insurrectionist against Rome, right?
Yeah, especially, this, right? The triumphal entry, the so-called cleansing of the temple, and of course the render unto Caesar moment. These three sort of add up to, insurrection is a good way to put it, Ben.
Yeah. Now, some of the commentary on this mentions that it is notable that he's riding a donkey instead of like a war horse. It's debatable as to whether there's a lot to that symbolism because donkeys were something considered royal, ridden by royalty at this time. But I do think that there is something to the fact that, a military leader returning from conquest would be most likely riding a war horse. And here Jesus is riding a donkey, not coming to conquer or to be a conqueror, even though the people may be thinking that's what's happening, right? He's coming to finally organize his forces and lead them against Rome. And that's why they're calling him their king and everything. And that's what ends up leading him to get in trouble.
For me, it's ambiguous, Ben, because if we go back to Zechariah 9:9 and then verse 10 too, especially if we look at verse 10, right? Alter points out in a footnote on a lowly man riding on an ass, right? He has the translation as a lowly man riding on an ass, comma, on a donkey, comma, the foal of a she-ass. So there's no and, right? It's a even, right? We can translate, Kai even translates even. So even the Greek, as it's in Matthew, supports the reading even. The problem is he says them, right? He says them. So that's plural. But here's what Alter says. This is a surprising switch. Though a victor, the king comes as a lowly man. In the earlier biblical period, donkeys were actually the mount of royalty. But at this late moment, and this is in Zechariah, so New Testament's even later, horses would have been used. The introduction of the ass here anticipates the elimination of horses from Jerusalem in the next verse, which reads, "And I will cut off the chariots from Ephraim and the horses from Jerusalem."
So this whole scene, as I mentioned before, is reminiscent of a triumphal return of the king to the city, a royal procession. It also is indicative of some later symbolism and imagery that happens in statements about the second coming of Jesus. And in those statements, the idea is that the faithful will go up in the clouds to meet him as he's coming. And again, the idea here is that the king is returning, right, to the city from being gone for a while. And those who are his, greatest supporters actually go out to meet him. And so that's the idea with the second coming, is that the faithful, his supporters, are going to go to meet him. This becomes kind of renegotiated and used to create the concept of what we now call the rapture. But this was a new concept that was brought about within the 1830s. It wasn't an idea of the time or even early Christianity. There was no concept of a rapture. This is a much later interpretation within the past couple hundred years.
But given that you've brought up, these eschatological points, surely we'll come back to this when we come to Revelation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ben, there's something else here I wanted to point out. I stopped reading the NRSV translation, so I'm just still reading Rudin for the Gospels at least, and comparing with the King James Version. Rudin points out that the word, when the disciples of Jesus say to the owner of the donkey, the master of the donkey wants it. That word means, or I don't actually know what the King James says, but the point is
the Lord.
The word, the Lord. Okay, so the Lord could just be, it could be the owner, but they're saying this to the owner.
Yeah.
And so there has to be some kind of recognition on the part of the legitimate owner that they're not the legitimate owner, that Jesus is. So that's curious too.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah. So Jesus at this point goes to the temple, and apparently one of his first acts is to drive out these money changers and those who are selling cattle in the temple. That is very common, I think, within general Christian interpretation of the scripture. And I actually went and read some commentary on this, maybe conservative Christian commentary, and I've seen this within Latter-day Saint circles, to say that what was going on there was illicit, that they shouldn't have been changing money, quote unquote, in the temple. And we'll get to that word "in" here in a bit that's used in the scriptures. But the fact is that these were activities that were supposed to be happening. So when the people came to the temple to make sacrifice, make an offering, there were two different things that they needed to do. One, they needed to pay the temple tax, the money, and that could only be paid in a certain coinage, certain currency, and that was the shekel. And so they had to exchange their Roman money for the temple money. And so there were people there that would do that for them so that then they could pay the temple tax. The next thing is, if they were going to bring an animal to be sacrificed, if they were coming from far away, it wasn't always practical for them to bring an animal with them. So rather than bring one with them, they would come to the temple, they would buy an animal, with money and then offer that animal as sacrifice. So the people that were there selling the animals or exchanging the money, this was a practice that had been in place for a long time, and there wasn't apparently anything wrong with the practice itself. What Jesus seems to be objecting to here is that there was extortion going on, right? Like the exchange rates were not fair. People were being extorted. They were charging too much for the animals, like, above a fair price, stuff like that. And so these poor people that had come to the temple to make offerings, to be pious, were then being extorted. And this is the practice that Jesus seems to be objecting to.
Yeah. And then, of course, overall, that's a result of a bigger problem, which is that the people who are running the temple are not with the people, they're with the government.
Yes.
Right? They're actually appointed by Rome. And yeah, there's a lot of corruption going on. But the corruption isn't, as you've said, Ben, making the animals available or the exchange available, right? And it's also not that it's going on in the temple. So let's get into that. Anytime we read in King James Version that Jesus is in the temple, yeah, I think every time, right? Every time. Jesus isn't someone who actually goes into the temple to do what's done in the temple. That's something reserved for the priestly class, which again, at this point are, they're appointed by Rome.
I should point out, Christopher, it's not just in the King James that it says in the temple. NRSV says in the temple as well.
Oh,
so,
well,
yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. So I like the way Rudin deals with this. She always translates in the temple precinct.
Yeah, there you go.
So what does that mean, Ben?
It's the temple grounds, right? So like there's different courts around the temple. There's what you call the court of the Gentiles, which basically everybody was welcome there. Everybody could come into that space. And that's where this is happening, this buying and selling and all this. And this was a common area where people gathered often and these kinds of things happened. Then you had more inner courts where only certain people were allowed. And as you went farther and farther in, the people that were allowed were smaller and smaller groups of people till you got into the actual temple structure itself, that with the roof, right? And only the priests were allowed in there. And then the Holy of Holies was only the high priest, and he only went in there once a year, right? To do the offering.
Right. You know what this reminds me of, Ben? The Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which used to be, before it was the Umayyad Mosque, it was a cathedral. Before it was a cathedral, it was a Roman temple. And before it was a Roman temple, it was the Temple of Bel. So it's a really ancient site. It's in the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, right? Damascus. And on weekends, when I would go there, when I was living in Damascus, if you enter into the mosque where you take off your shoes and you go inside, right? You come into a courtyard and people were picnicking. Families, sitting on the marble floor picnicking. But then if you go into the prayer hall, there's no one picnicking inside. That's different. People are in there praying. Same idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, these activities would have been permitted in this area, but there's this phrase that we use often. We say Jesus is cleansing the temple. I know, Christopher, you didn't think that the phrasing of that, the use of that word was very helpful as to what's really going on here.
Well, okay, so I think it's true that he's cleansing the temple. I just think it doesn't lend itself well to a nonviolent reading. And so, again, the idea that he's going to cleanse it of these wicked people and, whip them, which we don't have any whips here, by the way, in the versions of the story that we read in this week's reading, right? But I do think there's a cleansing going on. But again, it's not that there's animals being sold or money being changed, but rather the corruption of the people who are doing it.
Right.
And the spirit in which it is done. So that there is a cleansing in that sense. So with that, caveat, I would go with, okay, it's the cleansing of the temple. Yeah. Sure. That's what we call it.
Sure.
The triumphal entry, the cleansing of the temple, these episodes, which again, these are how things are spelled out in the gospel parallels at the back of the standard works. And in our document that we put together, we actually plug the text into not just the names of the pericopes of these events or stories or vignettes, but the actual text side by side, all the Gospels.
And this cleansing culminates in the very next verses with Jesus healing the blind and the lame, which what's interesting about the mentioning of the blind and the lame is that these are two types of afflicted people that are specifically pointed out in Leviticus, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 21, as not being allowed to approach the temple for sacrifice, right? These are supposed to be excluded. Now, it could be that they were permitted in this court of the Gentiles, right? But it's not clear exactly what they would have been doing there. The idea of this space would be for people to come and go from their sacrifices to the temple. And normally these people wouldn't have been people that are allowed to come and make sacrifices. So the fact that Jesus is there healing or curing them, and I know you have some thoughts on the use of those different words, and it's translated differently. You know, in NRSV it says cure, that he cures them. The fact that he is there and he's healing or curing these people, to me, kind of is the reverse of what's just happening with him casting out the money changers, right? He's saying, hey, what you're doing doesn't belong, or the way you're doing it doesn't belong. But these people who would normally be excluded from the temple cult, right, or the temple rituals, I'm going to heal them. They do belong here.
Right, and we could read that as they're cured, and therefore Leviticus no longer has any bone of contention with them, right? Or, borrowing from Borg, the distinction, that's Marcus Borg, the distinction between healing and curing. If we say he's healing them, which I'm not sure, why you'd translate cure, but Jesus is healing people. This is part of the project. And healing is a social thing, right? Mm-hmm. Curing is a physical thing. I don't know whether he cured them, but I know he's doing healing. And healing means if they say you can't be here, I say you can. If nobody will talk to you, I will. If nobody will walk with you, I'll walk with you. That's right. Healing.
Yeah. That's bringing a community back together. That's the literal remembering, right? These parts that are disparate, putting them back in their proper place where they belong.
Exactly.
So next in the narrative, we get the story of the fig tree. This happens a little differently.
That's a curious one.
Yeah, it happens a little differently in the between Matthew and Mark. And I think that Mark has a word that's included in the statement that brings out some interesting ideas that Matthew doesn't have in there. And so I think we'll talk about that when we get to Mark. But there's some symbolism going on here that's not as obvious in Matthew as I think it is in Mark.
I would agree. We'll wait until we get to Mark to go into that.
Yeah. Another interesting curiosity that I found as I was reading through this and looking at footnotes is when Jesus quotes the scripture in Psalm 118 about the cornerstone that was, the stone that's being rejected becoming the chief cornerstone. Now, this is translated as cornerstone, but it could also be translated as keystone. Now, these are two different things in a building, right? And so they're both very important stones, but they serve different functions. And so I just thought it was really interesting how this could have been translated as keystone, and for me kind of fits the overall imagery going on here. Because the idea is that the builders reject this stone. They think it's not suitable for what they're doing. Maybe they're building an arch, right? And as they're building an arch, they say, this one isn't appropriate. But when they get to the top of the arch, they say, oh, actually, it fits just right. And they put it in, right? It becomes the keystone. And then the idea later in the imagery is that, if you reject that, it falls and crushes, those who rejected it, right? Because maybe they put it in the wrong spot. So for me, the keystone idea just fits a little more because it was on the ground, they rejected it, but then it actually ends up getting exalted into the highest position in the arch. So it's from the low to high idea.
Yeah, I love your reading, Ben. I think, the reason when you say it can be translated keystone or cornerstone, even though there's really two different things, entirely different things, I think what you mean is we don't really know how to translate this. We just know it's a stone. It's an important stone, and we don't know which one it is. So different translators will go with different ideas of the most important stones, which are the cornerstone and the keystone. Yeah. But I like your reading.
Yeah.
We have next this idea of the people asking Jesus where he gets his authority. And so what he wants to do is say, okay, tell you what, you answer me where John gets his authority, and then I'll answer you where I get my authority. And they say, we don't know. And they say that because they don't want to say it's from heaven, because then why didn't you trust him, right?
Yeah.
And they don't want to say it's from human beings because the people around them, the crowd, believe John is a prophet.
Yeah.
And so they'll have to deal with the crowd if they say that. And so they don't answer. And he says, well, I'm not going to answer you either.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of in line with some other stuff that's going on in these chapters. His detractors here, those that are questioning him, trying to trip him up, they're trying to toe this line, right, between the religious society and the Roman society. And so they don't want to accept John's authority because there's all kinds of implications of that. They don't want to reject it either, because of the people. So they're always trying to toe this line between these two things. They don't want to fully commit to anything because it might mean that they gets them in trouble with one side or the other. And Jesus is kind of calling them out on that. And so then they try to call him out on that, right? They try to say, they come with the tax thing, right? Who do we pay taxes to? And Jesus then again is presenting them with a scenario in which they have to choose, and they're silent because they don't want to have to commit to anything.
Right. Yeah. As you study this text closely, as Ben and I have had the responsibility to do to bring it to you, right? And especially if you get behind the translation into the Greek a little bit. And I don't mean you don't have to read Greek. Again, in our studies, we have scholars telling us these things, right? But I will actually read something here from the Greek, because there are a lot of statements from Jesus that have sort of some rhetorical punch to them, right? They're smart alecky in some way, for example. And that's just one example. So we covered this story a couple of weeks ago in another reading, right? But you have this feast where the people who are supposed to come don't come. And the guy who has prepared the feast says, well, just go find me anybody. And he goes to just slaves, right? And then he goes, and that's in the city. Then he goes out to the country to like the lowliest of slaves, right? Let's have those people come. And so in verse 14, we read, and this is in Rudin's translation, usually this is translated, many are called, but few are chosen.
It's not really clear how that is a conclusion drawn from the story to me.
Well, there's that, but it also doesn't give you what Rudin calls the jingly wordplay.
Oh, yeah.
I'll read the Greek out loud so you can get a sense of it. Poloi gar esin kletoi, oligoi de ekletoi. Can you hear the
repetition of some sounds? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The alliteration, I was going to say. There's this alliteration going. So there's this jingly effect, right? And so she says, there are a lot of invited guests, but not a lot of the chosen best. I like how she does that. She preserves that jingly sound.
There you go.
So they end up just going out again for all these random people. So then we have the story of render unto Caesar.
Right. So what we were just talking about a bit ago, they come and they ask Jesus, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar? Right. So this has been discussed quite a bit. This is a famous story, famous question asked to Jesus because he answers it so masterfully. But there's a lot going behind the scenes here politically and socially that we miss out on within our modern context. And that has to do a lot with this coin that's in question, and it's the tribute money. And so Jesus says, bring me the tribute money. And he asks them, whose image is that? Well, it's Caesar's image and the inscription. Well, what's not said in the text is what the inscription says. And everybody at the time knew exactly what the inscription said, right? Like, I know that coins aren't used as much anymore, right? People use their credit cards and everything like that. But typically people, they know what a quarter says on it, right? On the face says, "In God we trust." It says, "E pluribus unum" on the back. But everybody knows the money says, "In God we trust." There's always this discussion about it. And so everybody knew what this coin said. The coin says, "Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus."
In other words, the Son of God.
The Son of God, right here on this coin, and showing it to them. Now, this is in many ways blasphemous to the Jews, right? That the fact that they have this coin that is stating the divinity of the emperor, and they're having to pay tribute using this coin. And so Jesus is kind of turning this back on them, and he says, "Whose is this?" Right? Whose coin is this? Who's this belong to? He said, "Well, you pay it to Caesar. This is Caesar's, has his name." And then in the King James Version, we get this word render, which is archaic. We don't use this word anymore in our vernacular these days. And so really, we could translate this better as give back, right? Not just give, but give back. Return this to its owner, right? Who is the one who is interested in money? That's Caesar. God is not the one that's interested in this kind of money, right? Give the things back to God that are God's. Well, there's a whole lot wrapped up in that give back to God the things that are God's, because where are they when they're having this discussion? They're there on the temple grounds, right? And the idea is that the Romans have control through the priests that they appoint. They have control of the temple rites, the temple rituals. And Jesus is saying, no, this is Caesar's. The temple is not Caesar's. This needs to go back to him. That's the subtext of what's being said here. And it's inflammatory, right? But it also calls these people out that are asking him the question about where their loyalties lie. Do they lie with Caesar? Do they lie with God? Right?
Yeah, there's something else I want to bring up. But first I'm going to read a quote from John Dominic Crossan's book, God and Empire, Jesus Against Rome, Then and Now. I've read this before. I'm going to read it again. Imagine this question. There was a human being in the first century who was called Divine, Son of God, God, and God from God, whose titles were Lord, Redeemer, Liberator, and Savior of the world. Who was that person? Most people who know the Western tradition would probably answer, unless alerted by the question's too obviousness, Jesus of Nazareth. And most Christians probably think that those titles were originally created and uniquely applied to Christ. But before Jesus ever existed, all those terms belonged to Caesar Augustus. To proclaim them of Jesus the Christ was thereby to deny them of Caesar the Augustus. Christians were not simply using ordinary titles applied to all sorts of people in the East. They were taking the identity of the Roman emperor and giving it to a Jewish peasant. Either that was a peculiar joke and a very low lampoon, or it was what the Romans call majestas and we call high treason. End quote. And that, folks, will get you crucified, right? That's high treason.
Right.
So I think what's going on here, yes, what you say about the temple is valid, but in between, right, where you started and where you ended, let's just insert this. Give back to Caesar's what is his, he says. Just give it back to him. It's his. It's his face on it, and he thinks he's God. And give to God what's God's. What he did there is he just distinguished between God and Caesar. But for Romans, Caesar is God. And so he's saying Caesar's not God, God is God. Give Caesar his coin and God his temple.
Yeah, and there's something really interesting going on, first, second century CE with Christianity. So remember that this gospel is written, quite a few years after Jesus. And a lot of it is commentary on what is going on with Christianity at the time that it's written, not just at the time of Jesus's life. And what you had was, the Jews had a special exception to the cult of the emperor, as we call it, right? So all of the nations that Rome conquered were required to give some sort of homage or worship, in a sense, to Caesar. And in a polytheistic world, to use a simplified term, that wasn't necessarily a problem for them, right? It was just one more god for them to make an offering to, and it didn't have to offend the other gods. But for the Jews, this was a problem because they were only supposed to worship the God of Israel, right? And so they did get a special dispensation or a special exception for this point. But later, when Christians kind of started coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, they weren't following Jewish practices. They weren't doing the same thing that Jews do. They would eat pork, or, they didn't celebrate Sabbath on the same day, stuff like that, right?
They were uncircumcised.
Yeah, they were uncircumcised. That was a big one. And this was a lot because these were Greeks or Gentiles, as they were called, and they didn't follow the Jewish tradition. Well, then, so Rome says, well, you don't get a special exception because you're not Jews, right? So you need to worship Caesar. You need to pay homage to Caesar as well. Well, this became a problem for the Christians, and so was one of the contributing factors to why they were persecuted so much. So again, what we see here with this distinction that Jesus is making is also commentary on the time in which the gospel was written, which is, 50, 60 years later.
Yeah, I want to go into this a little bit more because that begs the question, why wouldn't the Christians get a special dispensation too? And the short answer is their religion isn't ancient. Mm-hmm. Right? This is some newfangled thing. Romans are not into newfangled things.
Well, a lot of them are Greeks. They're supposed to, you're Greek. This is the way you're supposed to be worshipped.
Yeah, what's the problem, right? Why is this a problem all of a sudden? So it's not an ancient practice. It's this newfangled thing. You even have the newfangled poets, as they were called. They're writing love poetry. The Romans were very conservative and didn't go around. Did they love their wives? Sure, but they didn't go around telling people and writing it in poems, right? So you get Catullus and Propertius writing love poetry and Cicero making fun of them, right? What is this? Yeah. What are you doing? What is that, right? So
you don't
that's
get
part of
grandfathered
it.
in.
Yeah, and so then the other problem is for the Christians is when they are asked to make just a token sacrifice. You can just imagine sort of a George W. Bush moment. Either you're with us or you're against us, right? We just want you to make a token sacrifice to show us that you're not our enemy, that you're actually with us. The problem for Christians is there are two senses of false gods. When we say false gods, right, that means something like they're not actually gods. They don't actually exist, or they're not actually gods if they do exist, right? But there's another way to read that, right? And the other way to read it is they do exist, but they're not gods, they're demons. How can a Christian make a sacrifice on the altar to a false god, to a demon, in front of the true and living God? Mm-hmm. He can't. He would have to die, right? And so the Romans thought this was just unreasonable.
Yeah. Yeah. And treasonous.
Right, exactly. And the plot thickens on this further down the line. They're going to be persecuted for this reason.
Right, it does. The next thing we have is this very interesting question posed by the Sadducees, which are a very infrequent interlocutor with Jesus. But here's one of their major questions that comes up in the Gospels with Jesus. So the Sadducees, they don't believe in resurrection and afterlife the same as the Pharisees do, and as apparently Jesus is teaching here. And so they devise up this question for him that is like their famous gotcha question, right? Like it's the difficult question that nobody can answer. Did we say this? We had this joke in seminary. We say, "Did Adam have a belly button?" Right? This is the question that everybody talks about. Yeah, one of those questions. Okay, so this woman marries a man and he dies, and so according to the law, she is supposed to marry his brother and marries, the 7 brothers up until the last, and she dies. Okay, so when they're resurrected, whose wife is she going to be? And Jesus says, hey, you're just not even asking the right question because you don't get the way that this all works. When the resurrection happens, they aren't going to marry or be given in marriage, right? And so you're saying they don't understand. Now, this poses sort of a challenge in many ways to the Latter-day Saint doctrine and concept of eternal marriage. And I have read various supposed apologetics explanations of this from Latter-day Saints, some a little more believable than others, but most of them just don't really get to it. One that I recently read tried to get into some Greek grammar of it, and it just really, I think, missed the point of this. Jesus is talking about people being married after resurrection and saying it's not a thing. Or I should say, Matthew is saying that Jesus is talking about the resurrection and it not being a thing for marriage.
Or we could say, whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew.
Yes.
Or we could say, whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew is saying, right?
That's right.
So there's nuance to this, right?
There is nuance, and there's different ways somebody could go with this, right? You could say Jesus is being misquoted or he's being enigmatic, and so we just can't really understand what he's saying. So one thing to remember here is that the author of this gospel, he is dealing with certain issues and questions in his time, just as like we talked about before with the whole contrast between Caesar and God, right, with the coin. He is dealing with certain questions in his space and time. And a lot of these theological or eschatological or soteriological questions come up within the Gospels. And it is very common for a writer in this genre, this time, to take their question and their view on something and put it in the mouth of Jesus as if he said or explained something in a certain way. And that's not to say he didn't. It's just that's the tool that they use to convey their ideas and their theology on this thing, right?
This is a similar problem to getting at Socrates' ideas, right?
Yeah.
We don't have
we only have Plato.
Socrates. Yeah, we only have Plato, what Plato says Socrates said. So Plato's putting his ideas in Socrates' mouth.
Yeah. And so that is one of the possible things that's going on here, right? Matthew is giving us his understanding, or the author of the Gospel of Matthew is giving his understanding of resurrection and marriage, and how he and his time responds to the question that the Sadducees posed. But it could be that Jesus never dealt with this question at all, right? It didn't come up.
Right.
And so I think from a Latter-day Saint perspective, where we have this doctrine of eternal marriage, at least as it's been negotiated and is currently understood and practiced, it doesn't have to be something that we look at these verses and say, oh, Jesus absolutely said the opposite of what we believe, right? Like, you definitely could take it that way. And there's, plenty of evangelicals that are going to pull out this verse and say that. But when you step back and you consider the context of the book, how the author operated, there's a different way to go with this than, having to delve into some, obscure Greek grammar to try to make a point that really doesn't stick.
Ben, a couple of things. Without naming names, I'd like to ask you to go into a little bit that what I'm going to say is the wrong answer. It's a wrong answer, at least, right? There are probably multiple wrong answers. And then let's actually go into the Latter-day Saint concept of eternal marriage as it has been negotiated and as it's understood now, because there's been a development to that doctrine too.
Yes, there has. So a couple things. If we look at the Latter-day Saint doctrine of eternal marriage and kind of how it's developed, the original concept, or original may not be the right word, but the concept, that the way that it was understood when it was first revealed or brought out to the saints, had much more to do with uniting the people as a whole into family type relationships. So you had all kinds of people being sealed to each other. The idea was you had this great family of God, and everybody was sealed together, and you were sealed to this apostle and that apostle. And sometimes you were sealed to your parents and sometimes you weren't, right? It wasn't strictly about the familial relationships themselves, as it was more about the idea that the gospel united people as if they were family, right? And so that over time, for theological reasons, for, there was political reasons there too, has come to where it is now, where it's understood as more an idea that solidifies or spiritualizes the blood relations, or even adopted relations, that happen between parents and children, and between a husband and a wife, right?
Well, it becomes more about the nuclear family than the family of God, as Bene Adam, as children of Adam.
Yeah. And that's not to say those are wholly different concepts. It's just a development of the understanding and the practice, right? So to go back to how these scriptures are approached from a Latter-day Saint apologetic point of view, there's a couple different approaches that have been taken. And the first one that I remember reading, back in maybe missionary days or whatever, was commentary on this verse. And the idea behind it was that, Jesus is just saying that, whatever questions of marriage aren't dealt with after the resurrection. All questions of who's married to whom are dealt with before the resurrection, not after the resurrection. That's sort of the commentary on this, saying that that's what Jesus is talking about. And so after the resurrection, you don't have people getting married. They're already married because it's already handled beforehand. Now, sort of to double down on that point, there's some additional commentary that I've seen from someone that tries to go and take the Greek grammar of these verses and say the marrying and giving in marriage are these actions that are taken rather than a statement of the condition of the person, right? They're not married per se, or they're not giving in marriage or marrying after the resurrection. They're already married, right? It's a condition. So they're trying to say that the Greek grammar is only talking about the action of getting married or giving in marriage, not the fact that the person is married. And I just think that's a stretch, because the point here that Jesus makes about angels is that the people will be like the angels in heaven, which are single, right? That's the idea.
Ben, that brings us into a whole other can of worms that I'm actually going to bow out of, because we don't have the concept of angels. We don't have the angelology, right?
Right.
That our fellow Christians have.
This keeps getting deeper and deeper. Yeah.
We'll just have to pass over this in silence because we can't spend all night on this, right?
Yeah.
But that's another problem with this kind of reading.
There's too many assumptions made. Yeah.
There's a mystery here, right? I think, I'd like to go back to this text tells us what the author of the Gospel of Matthew believed. And we don't have to believe the same thing they believed. And we don't even believe the same thing that early Latter-day Saints believed about eternal marriage. There's a great book from Greg Cofford Books. It's called This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Theology, which shows not only on this topic, marriage, whether it's the Godhead, all kinds of doctrinal concepts, how they have developed from the time of Joseph Smith, right? From the time of Joseph Smith through today. And they're not the same, right? They're not the same. So another explanation of all of this is the restoration is ongoing.
Right.
And I would say, I would back this up. I would pan out rather. And I would say the revelation of God is ongoing. I think God is revealing himself ever so slowly over eons, right? And that's what we've seen, Ben. You and I, we started with Genesis, right?
Yeah.
And here we are with Jesus of Nazareth. And that's what we've seen.
Yeah.
We've seen a development, and that's been very much at the heart of our hermeneutic. We've been able to say just because ancient peoples believed that bad things happened to them because God was zapping them doesn't mean we have to believe that. Just because they thought God was their warrior God doesn't mean we have to believe that. Just because they thought God was violent doesn't mean we have to believe that. They're ancient peoples. Of course they believe that. We don't think that way anymore. And as a matter of fact, we've also pointed out that all of these texts, these sacred texts, everything in our canon and the extra canonical and those in other people's canons too, they have to be renegotiated because our context isn't their context. And so they become, in some sense, irrelevant to us if we try to take them, in our context, unless we renegotiate them. And so we've had to do that. Not to mention that we're talking about disparate texts, right? We're talking about a collection of texts that we like to call a book that's really a library, written over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Right. It's written over hundreds of years by multiple different authors with different theologies, with different purposes in writing, with different audiences in mind. And a lot of what we see here, as you pointed out, Ben, to tie a neat bow on it, is writing things backwards. As a matter of fact, this week, in this week's reading in Luke, we get the verse that tells us that Luke comes after 70, after the destruction of the temple, because there's a dead giveaway in the chapter we're reading, one of the chapters we're reading this week.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump into Mark chapter 11 now, Christopher, and here is where we get the discussion that we're going to come back to the fig tree here. In this discussion of the fig tree, that Jesus comes and sees it's producing no fruit and then pronounces a cursing on it. And then in this version of the story, he doesn't immediately see the fig tree die, right? I believe that's what happens in Matthew, but they later see it, a consequence. It's not an immediate thing.
It doesn't just wither before their very eyes.
Yeah, exactly. Not just before their very eyes, right? The most interesting phrase here to me is in verse 13. Where it says this, it says, it was not the season for figs. All right, so a couple things here. First off, the word for season being used here is kairos in Greek, which can be translated time, but this is a time as in like a season, right? It's not the right time for that, right? It's not a chronological time, but this is a time that also has sort of maybe some theological baggage to it. This could be a time that is carrying a divine purpose to it. This isn't the chronological chronos, right? This isn't, what time is it kind of thing.
Well, chronology is about order of events, right?
Yeah.
Kairos, and this is a term that's very much in use in rhetoric, right? Kairos is opportunity, right? It's about the right time, right time for things, right? Yeah. So when there's a wedding, that's the time to say certain things. When there's a funeral, that's a time to say certain other things, right? And you can see here how a season is a good translation too, right?
Yeah.
But the curious thing is, if it's not the right season, Ben, actually, regardless, why is Jesus cursing this tree? I think if we get away from the literal interpretation of this tree, just like we should get away from the literal interpretation of the tree in the Garden of Eden story, then we find something else happening, right? There's a symbolism here.
Absolutely. That's absolutely the point here. Like, this isn't the season for figs. This isn't the right time for figs. And yet we have Jesus cursing the tree. It's not appropriate it seems arbitrary, I should say, for him to curse the tree because this tree should not have fruit right now. Like, it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It wasn't the right season for this. So since this is arbitrary because the tree is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, we have to look at this symbolic, right? This is a story that's a symbolic act that has more to do with the context of how Jerusalem and not the city or the people per se, but like the authorities of the city or as a whole is not accepting Jesus as a prophet, right? They're not bearing the fruit. And so that's the symbol of the tree. Doesn't have fruit on it as you would want it to, even if it's not the right season for it, right? And so it's cursed.
Ben, did you notice that Jesus addresses the tree in a personified way as female?
Yeah, he commands it.
Yeah, in a personified way as female. And that does reflect the feminine gender of the noun, right? And the pronouns that we can actually see in the Greek, but there's more to it than that. The fig tree is traditionally a symbol for Israel.
Yes.
And it's productive because of God, right? And so the destruction here actually looks forward to the destruction of the temple, which again sort of gives us a sense of the dating of this document too, right? If it's looking forward to the destruction of the temple, I mean, I can say, there's some kind of prophecy going here, but that's not even what's being claimed by the authors or even our fellow readers of this text. I mean, I guess maybe it could be. But what I see is the destruction of the temple has occurred, and that's why we're telling this story. And so what's going to happen is somebody else is going to be fruitful. We see this over and over, right? There are these stories where it's not Israel who's going to have the blessings or be fruitful or whatever, right? Whatever has been promised. It may even be the Gentiles, right? You can think of Jonah again, that same story. And we've seen that story show up over and over too, right? In different ways. The idea that they're better than the people that you think aren't God's people are actually better than the people who think they are God's people. And that can apply to us, Ben, right? Because now we think, oh, the silly Jews, they thought they were God's people, but now we think we're God's people.
There you go.
Right? It's like those silly people on the Rameumpton. That's not about us. We're not repetitive in our prayers. Oh, no. We just say the same thing over and over. That's different. We didn't write it down. We just say it.
Yeah, there was a talk in General Conference. It was like, I know some of you are thinking that you know a person that really could hear this talk. Really needs to hear this talk.
Yeah.
What if that's you?
What if that's me? Yeah.
So, Christopher, I'm going to go all the way to Luke chapter 19, verses 41 and 42. And I'm going to read these from the NRSV.
All right, I'm with you, Ben. Let's go.
As he came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes.
That reminds me of the title of Rene Girard's book, Things Hidden Since the Beginning of the World. I wonder if it's related to this, right? The idea that you're missing the point of what brings peace. It's not scapegoating, right? And so this is what Jesus is revealing. That's the Girardian reading, right?
Yeah. Oh, it fits. Yeah, I'm curious how Rudin translates these verses, Christopher, what we might pull out of her on this one.
Okay. And when he drew near and saw the city, he cried over her, saying, if only you too had known on this day what would bring peace. As things are, that's hidden from your eyes.
Okay. Very similar. So this is one of those verses, Christopher, I think that indicates how much of our experience, as you were saying, is about our epistemic reality rather than our metaphysical reality. Right. So the idea here being that so much can change simply by what we choose to focus on, what our perception is of the world. And, as we are is how we see the world, so to speak. Right.
Yes.
If you'll read verse 44 from Rudin, Christopher, go ahead.
And they'll bring you and your children inside you, level with the ground, and they won't leave one stone in you on top of another, to pay you back for not recognizing the time when God was here watching over you. This is the very verse that I mentioned earlier that dates the Gospel of Luke after the destruction of the temple in 70.
Now that translation I think is very helpful, Christopher, because it does seem to be a little more specific about who he's talking to. He's talking to Jerusalem. He's talking to the temple. In NRSV, it actually says they will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, right? Like, this could be seen as very violent, talking about people, and maybe it is or not, but this is in the context of him talking about the destruction of the city and the temple specifically. So when it's being brought down to the ground, right? This is the idea of one stone not being left upon another, the destruction of the temple that is quote unquote being predicted here, but like you said, dates it to that post 70 CE period when the temple is actually destroyed.
Yeah.
So again, the last phrase of that verse, though, says this, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. It says in there in the NRSV. Again, that recognizing the time, the kairos there, the right appropriate time, you're not seeing that. That's the epistemic reality, not the metaphysical reality. And what you see and perceive of the world around you then can help shape what that metaphysical reality is.
If we back up a verse, there's something else here to include. 43. But surely the days will find you when your enemies set up a barricade against you and encircle you all around and close in on you on every side. Now that sounds like something that would happen with an enemy in whatever context, at least in an ancient context, in your experience of watching movies, since you haven't lived in antiquity. Neither have I, by the way. But I do know a thing or two about how the Romans did these things. And they did a circumvallation. They would actually do a siege enclosure so that you could not escape and so that no one could bring you relief from the outside.
Yeah.
And the Roman idea of quote unquote pacification, right? This is a euphemism of a polity, as Rudin puts it, is also one way Romans termed its reduction and decimation, right? So it's a euphemism. So bringing peace, right?
Right. Yeah. Bringing peace. There you go. I mean, that is juxtaposed against what Jesus says in those previous verses. If you had known what really would have brought peace as opposed to the way the Romans are going to bring you peace, right?
Yes, their idea of peace. So that's at the core of the Gospels. As John Dominic Crossan points out in his oeuvre, right? He's going to say the Roman project is peace through victory. Their pacification, quote unquote, means we're going to decimate you. You saw what happened with the stones and the people, right? It is the people, Ben. Let's face it. Yeah. So that's what happened. So they're not going to put up with any nonsense, and we're going to bring everyone under Roman rule and Roman law, and that's what we're going to call peace. Whereas Jesus's project is peace through justice. So not peace through victory, but peace through justice.
And if you go back and actually look at the history of what happens here to the people in Jerusalem, 70 CE, when the Romans come in, it's, one of the most brutal and horrific episodes of Roman conquest that there is in history.
Indeed. The Romans did not take kindly to insurrection.
Right.
And this isn't just Jesus, by the way. There's an insurrection that occurs. And as a matter of fact, it would be confusing matters to tie the insurrection to Jesus. Yes, Jesus looks like an insurrectionist, but he's not the one that really caused the Romans to come down on Jerusalem.
Yeah. The 70 CE thing doesn't seem to have much to do with Christianity per se.
No, it's about the zealots, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's Luke 19.
Yeah. So Luke chapter 20, Christopher, pretty much everything in here is material that we've covered already in other parts. The main thing that I wanted to point out is just to reiterate that point about the cornerstone versus keystone over in verse 17. That word cornerstone could also be translated as keystone. And again, when I looked at the verse that way, it brought out a different meaning to me that was very interesting. And that's what I like about the way that these, you can translate these things is you can bring out multiple meanings and gain some different insight out of them.
Are you suggesting, Ben, that reading multiple translations and triangulating might yield insights? Because that's something I caught on to when I became bilingual, right? Just reading, King James in English and Reina Valera in Spanish.
Yeah.
Long before I studied Greek.
It's the way to do it.
So there's something else I want to point out, speaking of translation. In verse 34, in Rudin's translation, we read, "But Jesus said to them, the children of this world of time take wives and are given as wives. So this is back to the question of marriage that the Sadducees bring up. By the way, who are the Sadducees? That's a question for some people, right? The Roman historian, Jewish Roman historian Josephus mentions the Sadducees as an elite sect that overlaps somehow with the priesthood. So the Sadducees ask this question. Jesus is answering. He says, the children of this world of time take wives and are given as wives, etc. What does the NRSV read?
Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage.
Yeah, you see, that's closer to the Greek. I actually like the NRSV better than Rune. She says this world of time, and it gives you the impression, because we think of world as something other than an order. She's probably referring to a cosmos, right? But really she's dealing with what the NRSV calls an age, right? The translation here, the Greek here is aion.
Yeah.
Which
yeah.
there's an English cognate for, right?
Eon.
Eon, yeah.
Yeah.
What does the King James read?
Here's the King James. And Jesus answering said unto them, the children of this world marry and are given in marriage. Yeah, so that world.
Oh, so the world. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this world, she's calling it a world of time. We're talking about an aion, right? So let me just go into that a little bit. What is an aion? This is from Strong's. Strong's is a Greek concordance of the Bible. So every word in the Bible shows up in Strong's. It's given a definition. Strong's will give you every verse that includes that word. Something like BibleHub.com will give you the Greek, the KJV, other translations, every single verse it's in, definitions, transliteration, you name it, it's all there, right? So usage, definition, here's the definition: a space of time, an age. Usage, an age, a cycle of time, especially of the present age as contrasted with future age. So that's what's going on here, right? In this age, it's one thing. After the resurrection in the future, that's another thing, right? That's what's going on here. And also one of a series of ages stretching to infinity. And there's more. Again, consult Strong's. You can do this without buying a book. Nowadays, I honestly prefer, I have a book, if the I don't know, I probably have more important things to think about if the internet is down, but if my internet access is down, then I can pull out the book. Otherwise, it's on Bible Hub.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sense that we use the word age and, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, stuff like that. The age of information.
The information age, yeah. The age of Aquarius, into
age
which
of
I
Aquarius,
was born.
yeah, stuff like that. Yeah, yeah. You bring up a point with this verse, Christopher, that I guess we could throw this back into the discussion of resurrection and marriage, right? Because this is the same episode here, but it's described a little bit differently with the way that Jesus says this. The children of this age marry and are given in marriage, right? Almost to say that in another age, it might work differently. Right?
That's right. In our age, it does.
Yeah.
And in the restored church, it does, right?
interesting.
Sure. Yeah, that's another way to look at it. Good reading. So we have at the beginning of chapter 12 of the book of John, the Gospel of John, a scene that looks a lot like a scene we've seen earlier. Ben, you and I talked pre-show about whether this is the same scene, right?
Yeah.
We saw Mary or Mariam, right? That wasn't really clear. Both names were used in the same chapter within a few verses, washing Jesus's feet with her tears, anointing them, drying them with her hair. This seems to be a different, well, okay, it could be the same story dealt by two different authors in different ways, or it could be two different stories, because wherever Jesus goes, if he's a guest of honor, he could get his feet washed, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
By women. Now, in this case, it is Mariam, who's the sister of Lazarus, and she's actually serving Jesus, first of all. Now, this is odd. At least in Greek or Roman culture, a woman who's well-to-do isn't serving people, even in her own home, right? She's going to be dining with them, and somebody else is going to be serving them. But, Jesus did something for her. Maybe she wants to serve him herself. I don't know. But here's the part that I want to get into. She takes a pound of perfume, as Rudin has it, a pound of perfume, which was genuine, extremely costly nard, and spread it on Jesus' feet and wiped them dry with her hair. So we do have her wiping her. This is what made me think of the other story.
Yes.
It could be the same story. So what is nard? And what would a pound of it cost? Well, actually, we get how much a pound of it costs here in verse 5, right? Because Judas Iscariot is going to say, why wasn't the perfume sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the destitute? Now, 300 denarii is 300 days' labor's pay.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost a year's pay.
Yeah.
This is expensive stuff. Yeah. So I looked this up because, essential oils are available for sale today and are in vogue again, right? This thing was being done back then, and then it wasn't done, and now it's being done again, right? So I looked up the price of this particular essential oil, which is, I don't know how to say it, spikenard oil.
Yeah.
It's the same thing as what we have here in the text. And they're just two names for the same thing. I looked this up. I went into the Latin, the scientific name. It's the same thing. One of the sellers of essential oils today is offering 5 milliliters. That's approximately 1 teaspoon for $72 retail. If you're a wholesaler, $54. Okay. So somewhere between $50 and $75 for a teaspoonful. It comes from a plant from the Himalayas, which, let's pause just a minute and think, wow, they had essential oils from a plant from the Himalayas. I think it costs a lot less nowadays, and it's still expensive, right? It still comes from the Himalayas, and we still have to get it from there to here, but it's a lot cheaper nowadays than it was then, but it's still expensive. It's from the valerian family. Valerian is another essential oil my wife uses a lot. And the idea of putting on people's feet is very common too. This is how it's done, right? My wife is always putting essential oils on my feet. And what this particular oil is used for, this essential oil, it has aromatic use, right? And that's actually expressed here in the text, that the whole house was full of the scent, and it's called a perfume, right? But it actually is relaxing to people, right? Actually, it tranquilizes people. Mm-hmm. Didn't you say there's another from the same family? You told me pre-show there's another one I recognized.
Yeah, it's related to honeysuckle or also jasmine.
Jasmine, right. Yeah, I didn't realize jasmine and honeysuckle were related. I remember jasmine growing on a trellis outside my room in Damascus, and it just smells amazing. And I've eaten honeysuckle. As a boy, I ate honeysuckle in my neighborhood in Baltimore. I've never eaten jasmine. I've had jasmine tea. They are a lot alike. So a lot of these oils are used in that way, to calm people. It's used in perfumes as it is here because it's woody and spicy and musty as this website has it. So that's the idea of this essential oil.
Luxurious.
It is, and so to Judas Iscariot's question, right? Why not sell it and give the money to the poor? We get Jesus's answer, right? So I'm reminded the answer here, according to in Rudin's translation, it's verse 7 is, but in answer, Jesus said, let her alone. She bought it to keep for the day I would be prepared for burial. There's that. But it reminds me of an earlier story where Jesus is saying, hey, this is the time to be with me, right? To be present to I'm here, right? The bridegroom is present. And so it's not a time for mourning. It's a time for rejoicing. So I relate these two stories in that way, right? Yeah. It's about kairos again, right? It's about the appropriate time. What is the appropriate thing to do at this time?
It's hard to not say that Judas has a point, right? Why is it that Jesus should indulge in such a luxury, right? Or should allow someone to indulge in such luxury? I think one of the points being made here is that it's not Jesus that asked for it. He didn't tell them to buy it. This was a service, something that somebody of their own will and volition wanted to do for him. He is poor, by the way, he's homeless. And this was something she was doing to show her love and devotion.
Oh, you mean Jesus was poor and homeless?
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, look, if somebody wants to do something nice for someone else, let them do it. Right? This is what she decided to do. She made a special sacrifice to get this. Maybe she's not using the whole thing. I don't know. But Judas, I think, does have a point. But Jesus's point is that, look, it's okay to enjoy some of these gifts that people give you, right? I guess is the idea. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. You know what this reminds me of, Ben? I think I found a parallel in my own experience. What you said really helped me to see this, right? I was chronically ill, and it was because of the food in my country. I live in the United States, and I'm more sensitive than other. I think the food, or rather, it's the real problem is edible food-like substances, as Michael Pollan puts it, right? So those edible food-like substances are not good for anyone. But I am sort of the canary in the coal mine. I'm the one who really is the one who suffers most obviously and most quickly and more readily, right? So I just have a hard time with that. And so it really helped me a lot. It took me about a year, but eating well has healed me, right? So now the problem is, what if somebody offers you something to eat? And my wife, she's told me to accept what people offer me to eat, and to realize, you're eating well almost all of the time, right? And so if someone offers you something of, more along the lines of edible food like substances than food, maybe you should take it because eating is still a matter of fellowship, right? As it was in Jesus's day, and as we've emphasized on this podcast, right, that he's healing people. He's meaning communities, not just individuals, by bringing people together at the table. And so I think for my wife, that's more important than maybe ingesting something that, you wouldn't normally ingest in other circumstances.
That's an interesting point too. Yeah.
I still shy away from edible food-like substances. I have a hard time.
Processed. So Christopher, I'm going to jump to verses 23 and 24. Here in my NRSV Bible, it says, Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Wow, this is great.
That
Great
is really
imagery, symbolism here, right? There's so much to this. But I just love how the idea here is that death leads to life. And that's kind of, this is John, right? This is high Christology, right? Jesus is always like foreshadowing his death and all this that's going to happen here. And he's just saying, hey, I'm going to die, but my death is going to bring life, right? A grain of wheat must fall to the earth and die in order to bear fruit. Now, technically what's happening to that grain of wheat, it's not dying, right? Like it's coming alive more than it ever was before. But in a metaphorical sense, it is dying because it's being buried beneath the earth, right?
Yeah.
And so it's symbolically dying so that it can produce more life than it ever had before. And that's just a powerful symbolism that's being brought out here.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a symbol that was used in the ancient temple in Plato's day. Right, in Plato's day, when you went to the temple, you left the temple with an ear of corn. You were given an ear of corn. Now, the interesting thing about this is the ear of corn is seed, right? And yet these seeds, as you hold them in your hand, are not going to germinate and they're not going to grow, right? You're not going to get a corn stalk out of them. That doesn't happen unless you take it from the light and you put it into the earth. Now, you can think of this in terms of premortal life, right? If you're in the light, in the presence of God, you can't actually grow. You have to be put down into the earth, you see? And then what happens? You grow toward the light. That's the image I see.
Yeah. And your roots go down deeper into the earth.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And now we come to, again, the conversation about the cosmic tree too, right? And that we can refer listeners back to our episode on Latter-day Contemplation, our sister podcast with Catherine Knight Sontag, the author of The Mother Tree. Now, on Easter Sunday, I had very few words before praying at the table. They may have even seemed perfunctory to my family. But the fact is, I put a lot of thought into what I said. I just didn't say much. And this is what I said. The most important thing to think about when thinking about resurrection, I said, is it takes dying first, right? It takes death to bring about a new life.
Yeah.
And then I prayed.
We had a little discussion on this, and one of the questions that came to my mind to ask the people my family that was there gathered with me as we were having a discussion was, when did the Easter story start? And you start going back and back and back. And I kind of threw out the joke, right? You always have to go back to Genesis, right?
That's right.
But, when did it start? And you could keep trying to go back before and before and before. But I think that, the story can't have started after at least the death, right? It has to start or at the latest with the death before you can get to the story of the new life.
Indeed. And so to be born to a new life, to be born to our true selves, we have to die to our false selves. And so that's what we get here. We get it in the following verses, right? We get talk of the self, of the soul.
Yeah.
Right? Whoever clings to his living self, right? This, I'm going to call it the false self, is going to lose it, right? But whoever hates his living self in the present world will keep it safe, and it will be a life for all time.
In verse 32, he says, when I am lifted up from the earth, again, this is the allusion to the seed dying in the ground, but growing into a tree, or a plant at least that's growing out. But here we have sort of the foreshadowing of the cross. But the plant bears fruit, right? Well, what is the fruit of the cross? It's Jesus himself. He's the fruit of the tree. His disciples then multiply after his death. This is the fruit that comes from the death, right? And then the resurrection. So this is an interesting concept of how the cross draws. He says, I will draw all people unto me. You know, how is it that the cross draws people into Christ? I think that Girard, his concept on this is really helpful. You know,
yes, that's what I was going to say.
The mimetic violence idea, and how Christianity flips that narrative so that people are identifying with the victim on the cross instead, right? They're drawn to that victim idea. It's just fascinating. There's this expectation and tradition that the Messiah wouldn't die. You know, here in verse 34, it says, the crowd answered him, we have heard from the law that the Messiah remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man?
By which is meant onto the cross, right? Meaning he's going to die.
Yeah, lifted up. Yeah, that's the euphemism for pass away, die, right? Yeah, put on the cross. So first off, they say the law, right? So if this is referencing the Torah, right? Or
is
the instruction, the law.
Psalms, Ezekiel, Daniel.
Yeah, well, nowhere in the law does it say this. In Psalms 89:36, that his line will continue forever. But Psalms isn't part of the law, right? It's not part of the 5 books of Moses or the prophets.
That's a good point. Neither is Ezekiel or Daniel.
Yeah, but it is heavily quoted. Psalms is heavily quoted in the gospel. And it's referred to as authoritative prophecy, especially about the Messiah.
Well, Psalms is even accepted in Islam, right?
Yeah. So even though it's not technically part of the law, it's an interesting statement here for the author to put in the mouth of the people. You know, it's not clear whether John, the author of this gospel, is agreeing with the people about, you know, whether Psalms is part of the law, or whether he's just putting this in their mouth, that maybe this was an attitude of the people, that Psalms was part of the law. You know, the lay person generally didn't even know how to read, right?
Sure.
and much less understand what books were and weren't part of the law. And so I think I should clarify on this. When I say that the lay person may not have known, you know, necessarily what books were part of the law, they may not have even known that they were quoting Psalms, right? This is just something that they hear as part of their liturgical practice.
That's right.
And part of their tradition that the Messiah would not die. This is the expectation, the tradition. And what it may have come from is this reference in Psalms. The people are saying this is part of the law, but there's nothing in it. So last thing I want to mention here comes from verse 47. I do not judge anyone who hears my words and does not keep them, for I came not to judge the world, but to save the world.
Yes, I knew we had to cover that verse, Ben.
So, you know, that's reminiscent of John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world. God sent not his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved, right?
Yes.
And Jesus here is saying, like I just read, I do not judge anyone who hears my words and does not keep them. Well, that's quite a statement, right?
It is.
And if you were to take that at you know, face value, apply it to all the other gospels, you'd be like, well, there something seems to be contradicting, because Jesus does seem to be judging people, right, who don't believe him. And so it is an interesting thing to kind of take that verse and say, how does this fit?
Well, is he judging them, or is he just pointing out when they're in error? And again, translating error rather than sin, right?
Condemning, yeah.
And he's asking them to change their minds, right, for metanoia, because they're in error, for hamartia, right? I think once you start saying sin and repent, then it sounds judgmental. So, yeah, I just said that.
Yeah. Well, the word judge here, I think, could be translated condemn, right? He didn't
Right.
come to pronounce a condemnation on the people.
A judgment,
he came
yeah.
to save them, right? To save them from that condemnation.
To change their minds.
Yeah, to change their
right?
minds.
To change their minds, yeah.
Yeah, as Rohr puts it, to change their minds about God, not to change God's mind about us.
Yes, exactly. That's a great place to end, Ben.
It is. Well, shout out again to all those that help us with the production of the podcast and Latter-day Peace studies in general. Very much appreciated. Kyle, for all the work you do, and Des and Bethany for the stuff that they're doing with social media and again, with the project in general. Thanks so much.
And to all our donors, thank you. And if you would like to volunteer or if you would like to donate, get in touch with us. Your donation is tax exempt. Latter-day Peace Studies is a 501c3 corporation, and our expenses are minimal. We're an all volunteer operation. There's hosting the podcast. There's whatever, this and that, filing with the government every year, whatever. So volunteers, donations, please reach out to us. And if you have comments, I hope, I keep saying this in hopes that somebody who can do it will do it. We need a way that you can comment on each episode on your podcast app, but you can't do that. So do it on YouTube or reach out to us personally or do it on social media. Each week, our team posts a link to the podcast on social media. That's a great place to have a discussion about the episode. And there's, of course, our Come Follow Me study group on Sunday afternoons, 2:00 Pacific. There's a link for that posted on our social media every Sunday, right before it starts. And I was about to say it's always the same. It can change. But yeah, it's posted every week. Thanks for being with me, Ben.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you for listening.